Morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Birmingham. We'll begin with a modest German lesson. It's Weigel. Or if you prefer, Weigel, but we haven't been Weigel for quite a while. Great pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Pioneer Institute for the invitation, Jamie Gass for setting all this up. And it seemed to me that rather than review the magisterium, the teaching of John Paul II on education, it might be more interesting and in fact more fun to take a brief pilgrimage through the educational experiences of John Paul II, asking ourselves along the way of that pilgrimage what he learned that might be useful for us today in the 21st century. So we begin our pilgrimage in the little town, population 10,000, of Wadowice, about 40 miles outside of Krakow, in the 1920s and 1930s. Decades of Polish jokes have led us to be somewhat blind to the fact that interwar Poland, the Second Polish Republic, had a very developed high culture, and that was reflected in the schools in which young Karol Wojtyła was first educated. Their curriculum would stun, I think, many students in American elementary and secondary schools today. And out of that experience of a fine classical education in a small town and an immersion in the history and culture of his country, Karol Wojtyła drew some very important lessons that would actually help him bend the course of the history of the 20th century in a more humane direction. And the primary lesson he learned had to do with the priority of culture. As many of you know, for 123 years, between 1795 and 1918, there was nothing labeled Poland on the map of Europe. In 1795, the three great powers of the neighborhood, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, completed the Third Polish Partition, and this historic country, which had existed since the 11th century, even the 10th century, simply disappeared from the map of Europe. There's no map of Europe printed between 1796 and 1918 that has Poland on it. And yet the Polish nation survived the loss of the country of Poland. How did that happen? What young Karol Wojtyła learned in those schools in Wadowice was that the Polish nation had survived through its culture, through its very distinctive language, the Slavic language written in a Latin alphabet, a remarkable literature, poetry, novels, plays, which kept alive the idea of Poland even when the political reality of a Polish state had simply evaporated. And, of course, its Catholic faith. The Catholic Church, during those 123 years, was a kind of national safe deposit box in which Polish identity was kept secure. So what did young Karol Wojtyła learn from all of that? He got an inoculation against the two heresies, shall we call them, bad ideas that made such a catastrophic mess of so much of the 20th century. First of all, the Jacobin idea launched in the French Revolution that history is driven by politics, and politics means my capacity to impose my power on you. And then the Marxist heresy, which taught that economics drives history. And when you put the two of those together, you get those totalitarian systems that Mr. Birmingham mentioned earlier. What Karol Wojtyła learned is that they're both wrong. What really drives history over the long haul, the most dynamic force in human affairs over the long haul, is culture. What a people cherishes, believes, worships, what a people is willing to sacrifice for, what a people is willing to bet its life and the lives of its children on. Culture is the most dynamic force in history over time, and of course the educational enterprise, which is the transmitting of culture from one generation to another, is therefore central to the human story. Now, culture can be both regenerating or it can be destructive. The destructive part we've certainly had a lot of experience of in the 20th century. Think, for example, of the interwar German Republic right next door to Poland, the Weimar Republic. Beautifully designed democratic system, constitution written in part by Max Weber, one of the great social scientists of all time, and yet a totally inadequate cultural foundation for democracy, such that when the pressure came on in the form of the Great Depression, the culture crumbled, the politics crumbled, and we should never forget that Adolf Hitler came to power through a democratic process, which he subsequently ended, of course, but came to power through a democratic process. If we are worried today about the state of our politics, that may have something to do with the state of our culture. And that's worth pondering and praying over and thinking about reforming. But culture can also be deeply regenerative. If you look at those remarkable 9 days in June 1979, when John Paul II went back to Poland for the first time as Pope, June 2nd to June 10th, you can actually feel the history of the 20th century pivoting. As he ignited what I have come to call over the last 25 years, a revolution of conscience. And out of that revolution of conscience came the nonviolent political movement that we call the Solidarity Movement. And throughout Central and Eastern Europe, men and women of conscience were inspired to take what John Paul II called at the United Nations in 1995, to take the risk of freedom. How did he do that in June 2nd to 10, 1979? He didn't do it by talking about politics, and he didn't do it by talking about economics. There were 52-some papal addresses of one form or another, speeches, homilies, impromptu sessions with various groups in those 9 days. And not once did he talk about economic life. The only nod to the Polish government, to politics, was at the beginning on June 2nd, hello, and at the end on June 10th, bye-bye. He talked about culture in the broadest sense. He said to his people in an infinity of variations on one great theme, you are not who they say you are, who the communist regime says. You are not who they say you are. Let me remind you who you are. And if you own that, if you own that identity, you will find tools of resistance that communism cannot match. And of course he was right, because 13 months later, Lech Wałęsa climbed the gate at the Gdańsk shipyards. The Solidarity Movement was ignited, and a people who had learned to live in the truth about themselves were empowered to, in effect, overthrow the greatest tyranny in human history. So that's not bad for something to have learned in elementary and secondary school. So the bar is now set very high for our friends from Cristo Rey here. Then we get to the Jagiellonian University, which Jean Paul II entered in 1938, and the Second World War. If If you read his little memoir, Gift and Mystery, John Paul II says that during his university years, which were of course quite odd because 4 of them were under this draconian Nazi occupation of Krakow, he was, these are his terms, not mine, obsessed with a passion for the theater. He was a student of Polish language and literature, probably intended at that point of his life to be an actor, possibly later in life a philologist, a professor of Polish language and literature. In any event, he was deeply involved in student productions during the one normal year of university life that he experienced, 1938 to 1939. And then during the war, he and 4 other young people and a remarkable character named Mieczysław Kotlarczyk began an underground theater group called the Rhapsodic Theater, whose entire purpose was to keep alive the idea of Poland at a moment in Polish history when the occupying power was determined to simply, as Hans Frank, the Governor General, put it, erase Poland from the history and memory of Europe. They did this by performing the great works of Polish poetry and drama in underground settings, apartments with the window shades drawn and all that sort of stuff, all at the risk of their lives. These are young people in their late teens and early 20s. And out of that experience, Wojtyła certainly got some skills. Sir John Gielgud, no mean actor himself, said that John Paul II had the greatest sense of timing he had ever seen in a public personality. Sir Alec Guinness, another no-slouch guy, remarked on his wonderful sonorous voice. So he got out of that experience, to use this horrible neologism of the sports pages, a skill set. But he got something else. He got an idea of what life is about. For John Paul II, life itself, human life itself, is inherently dramatic, or is structured dramatically. Why? Because each one of us every day lives in the gap between the person I am and the person I ought to be. So human life, and that's dramatic. I mean, that, I know who I am, I know who I should be, and I'm struggling to close the gap with the help of grace, believers would say. That's an inherently dramatic situation. I'm sure many of you have been to London. You know that throughout the London, 450 miles of the London subway system, there's that constant reminder, mind the gap, which means don't put your foot between the car and the platform. Well, the people who designed the London Underground didn't know that they were putting these reminders of the basic structure of the moral life all over London. Mind the gap. Think about the gap. Mind the gap. And we can only strive to close that gap if we understand that the person we ought to be is defined by certain settled moral principles. That some things are simply wrong in and of themselves. Doesn't make any difference what your intention is or what your intended consequences are. Some things are simply off the board or ought to be off the board by themselves. And to deny that, John Paul II later said in his encyclical on the moral life, Veritatis Splendor, Splendor of Truth, to deny that is to simply drain human life of its inherent drama. It's to take us out of the gap in a dehumanizing way. So that's the learning from the university years. Then, after some graduate study in Rome, in 1946, 47, early 1948, young Father Karol Wojtyła comes back to Krakow, and after the Archbishop had fattened him up in a rural parish, he apparently was a wraith when he came back from Rome. which is perhaps understandable because I'm told that horse meat was a staple of seminary diet in those days. He was assigned to an urban parish, St. Florian's, just north of the Krakow Old Town, where the great Cardinal Adam Stefan Sapieha wanted to establish a second center of campus ministry in Krakow. Sapieha knew that the battle with communism would be won or lost in the hearts and minds of the rising generation, the young people of Poland. And while there was already a well-established campus ministry at the Jagiellonian University, there was no such thing at the Krakow Academy of Arts, at the Polytechnic Institute, and other educational institutes. So he sends this young Father Wojtyła to go create a second center of campus ministry there, and he does it retail. He goes literally door to door in these dormitories and residence halls, rounding up kids at the height of the Stalinist terror in Poland. This was, in ministerial terms, the most formative experience of his life. This was the experience that made the priest, who made the bishop, who made the pope. When I was working on Witness to Hope, the Pope said to me, you can't understand me unless you understand the friends I made when I was a young priest, who remained some of his closest friends throughout his life, all lay people, a network now of 3 generations old. And as I got to know those remarkable people, some of whom are now very close friends of mine, I began to understand that this was an extraordinary manifestation or exemplification of what we call in ecumenical theology, inter-Christian dialogue, a mutual exchange of gifts. That's often a hollow phrase, but in this case, it's absolutely full of rich substance, because what it means is that while this young priest was helping form these university students into mature Christian men and women, getting married, forming families, entering professional life at all times, trying to maintain their integrity in this culture of lies that was Stalinist Poland, they were forming him into one of the most dynamic priests of his generation. And out of that came 3 really remarkable things. The first thing that he learned from that experience as a friend, guide, spiritual director, confessor to these young people is that young people don't want to be pandered to. Young people want to be challenged. They want to be challenged to heroism. They want to be challenged to live big. So much of our culture today panders to young people and tells them how wonderful they are and you can be all that you can be and blah, 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 without any effort. John Paul II knew that was not the case. He knew that young people wanted to be challenged to heroism. And he thought when he became Pope that the young people of the late 20th century were not all that different from the young people of the mid-20th century. The music might be a little different. The haircuts might be a little different. But that yearning for a large life, that yearning for a large soul was still there. So what comes out of that? World Youth Day. Something that people imagined to be absolutely inconceivable in 1978 when he was elected. Every 3 years or 2 years, we're going to get 1 million kids from around the world together with the Pope. Right. I mean, they literally thought he was nuts when he proposed this. But he had confidence in this yearning for a large soul. And that was his message at all World Youth Days. Never, ever settle for anything less than the moral and spiritual grandeur that God's grace makes possible in your life. You'll fail, That's no reason to lower the bar. Get up, dust yourself off, seek reconciliation and forgiveness, but keep the bar high. And kids responded to that. So World Youth Day. The second thing he learned in that experience, particularly in the experience of helping these young friends of his prepare for marriage and family life, was that young people want to love with a pure love. The yearning to love, which is built into us as human beings, seeks a pure object, a good object. Now today it's surrounded by all sorts of junk, but the yearning is for purity, for permanence, for real commitment and exchange with another. What came out of that? This remarkable body of thought we call the theology of the body, which John Paul II articulated over 5 years of general audience addresses, which has absolutely transformed marriage preparation programs in the living parts of the Catholic Church, and which I find ubiquitous on campuses. I have not been to a university campus in the last 15 years, and I mean big state schools, small Catholic schools, big Catholic schools, high price spread, Ivy League schools, where there is not a theology of the body reading group, often organized by the students themselves. An expression of that yearning for a pure love. And the other thing he learned from those experiences with young people is something he would later articulate philosophically as what he called the law of the gift. It goes back to this notion of the gap. How do we close the gap? We don't close the gap. We don't cooperate with grace in closing the gap by asserting ourselves. We cooperate with grace in closing the gap by giving ourselves. The fact that each of our lives is a gift to us is an elementary fact of biology. None of us is the cause of our own existence. But it's also, that elementary fact of biology also reveals something spiritual and moral about us. As our lives are a gift to us, so we are called to make our lives into a gift to others, and that's the royal road to human flourishing and beatitude. Then, finally, in the fourth instance of this pilgrimage, we have Professor Wojtyła at the Catholic University of Lublin, the only Catholic university between East Berlin and Vladivostok, 16 time zones, for a long time. And what he learned from that experience as a university professor that he brought to the papacy. And that primary learning was that the central crisis of our time, which is true of his time and I think is true of this particular moment, is in the idea of the human person. That our idea of what a human being is has gotten debased and corrupted and dumbed down, and out of that has come a lot of bad stuff. If we think of the human person, as the U.S. Supreme Court has now defined the human person, both in 1992 and in the recent Obergefell decision, as a bundle of desires to be satisfied. It's all we are. We're just all twitching bundles of desires to be satisfied. We have demeaned ourselves in a way that ultimately makes democracy impossible. I have 3 grandchildren. One is 11, one is 2.5, and one is 7 months old. The 2.5-year-old and the 7-month-old are tyrants. They are beautiful little tyrants, Catherine Claire and Lucy Gianna. They're really cute and they're tyrants, meaning they want what they want, when they want it, etc. Their older brother, William, is a terrific kid, 11 years old. So what closes what turns tyrants into wonderful kids, what turns tyrants into Democrats, lowercase d, who can live civil, tolerant lives in a functioning democracy. Well, that's the great task of education. It's first of all the task of families, but it's also the task of schools. Schools are laboratories where all those little tyrants are turned into the kind of people who can be the president of the Massachusetts Senate, or the mayor of Boston, or the ambassador to the Holy See, or whatever. We don't do that on our own. You know, left on our own, we're going to stay tyrannical. I could adduce some current public examples, but that's not what we're here for today. So that's one learning. And the second from that period for his papacy was that to lose a sense that there are just givens in life. To go back to what I said a moment ago, there are certain things that are just built in, and to lose sight of that is not only to make for miserable individual lives and a lot of unhappiness, it makes for slaughter. The great totalitarian systems of the mid-20th century were ultimately founded on bad ideas of the human person. In the Nazi case, racial and ethnic ideas. In the communist case, political and economic idea, but there was an idea of the human person at work there. And 70 million corpses later, we should have learned something about all of that. During his papacy, John Paul II talked a lot about education, particularly university education, but he also talked about the culture of education and its relationship to the culture of faith. The great document here is the encyclical of 1998, Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, which has, I think, two basic messages. One is that, well, the fundamental message is that, as the Pope puts it in the encyclical, faith and reason are like the two wings on which the human spirit ascends to higher things. That faith and reason are the two wings that lift us up. But unless faith is purified by reason, faith risks becoming superstition. Unless reason is open to faith, reason risks becoming a kind of shallow positivism, nihilism, skepticism, relativism. And I think that's what we're seeing all over the Western world today, particularly in Europe, but increasingly, I'm afraid, here. And that is the incapacity of faith devoid of reason, detached from reason, to maintain itself even in something as elementary to democracy as civil argument. If we wonder why today, as Ray Flynn and I were talking earlier, why are the hysterics dominating the conversation? It's not just because of Twitter and Facebook, although they have a lot of the blame. It's because of reason devoid from faith, which has become reason reduced to nihilism, skepticism, the quest for power, etc., etc. So those are some things from the educational pilgrimage of John Paul II that I think might be of some interest to you in your reflections this morning. Let me make one more point out of all of this. In the great social encyclical of 1991, Centesimus Annus, John Paul II asked all of us to think of people who come from backgrounds with a few less resources, not as problems to be solved, not as clients, certainly not as wards, but as people with potential to be unleashed. That's how we're to think about people who have less of what the world has to offer than others of us were born with or acquired. These are people with potential to be unleashed. And in the history of the Catholic Church in the United States, the greatest anti-poverty program, without a doubt, has been Catholic schools. Catholic schools are the most successful anti-poverty program in the history of the Church in the United States by orders of magnitude. Orders of magnitude. And to maintain and grow this heritage through innovative efforts like the Cristo Rey schools is not only a work of charity, it's a work of faith in the American future. It's a work of faith in these people with potential, these young people with potential. And it's an act of solidarity with the legacy of Pope John Paul II, who would be, I'm quite sure, absolutely thrilled at the idea and the reality of the Cristo Rey schools. And so I'm very happy as sort of a second-class relic myself, having spent all of this time with him. I think that qualifies me as a second-class relic. You know, I'm not a skullcap, I'm not a stole, I'm just a guy, but it's a second-class relic. And in the name of that, I want to commend all of you for this extraordinary work and what it does for these wonderful young people and what they're going to do with this for the future of the Church and the world. Thank you very much.